Hi, everybody. My name is Priyanka Bastula, and I am the co-founder and COO of Kalam Weekly. Welcome to our second virtual event. We're so proud, so happy that you're all here. I just wanted to say a few things before Pranaya takes over. We are recording this session, and I would like to request everyone to please mute your mics while the conversation is going on. I do, however, encourage you all to please write whatever questions that you may have during this conversation in the chat box. यो सेसन भइराख्दाखेरि तपाईहरुलाई केही प्रश्न छ भने चाहिँ हाम्रो chat box मा please write down your questions and they will be addressed towards the end of the talk where we will have a Q&A, during which you're also, of course, encouraged to ask questions. Thank you so much for being here. We're so happy. I cannot wait for this conversation. Thank you all, and I now hand over the conversation to Pranaya.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Marks, for agreeing to be here, agreeing to talk to us. For everyone else who is here, let me quickly introduce Dr. Marks. Dr. Marks has been coming to Nepal and been involved with Nepal for quite some time now. He is the Distinguished Professor and M.G. Edward G. Lansdale Chair of Irregular Warfighting Strategy at the College of International Security Affairs of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Marks has written the book that is the textbook on Maoist warfare since Vietnam. He is an expert on guerrilla and irregular warfare and has conducted numerous pieces of research on the Nepali Maoist insurgency. He's been here during the insurgency and after too. So we look forward to hearing from Dr. Marks on the Maoist conflict in general, but also just speaking about what happened before, what happened after, and just his general observations regarding the Maoist movement. It's especially important that we talk about this today because today is February 13th, the day when the war officially started. Now, with that, let me just allow Dr. Marks to maybe tell us a little bit about his relationship with Nepal when he first came here, and the many times that he's been back. So, Dr. Marks, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. For those who are curious, it's a little shy of 8 in the morning. I teach in a couple of hours, but I made it through the snow in order to be here in the office. It's interesting. Snow tells how my relationship with Nepal began. That is, during the Vietnam War, there was a magazine called Off Duty, which portrayed various places that service members could go during time off. And on the cover of one of them, while I was in Bangkok, no less, was the Himalayas as seen from Kathmandu. Now, of course, we all know what a fake picture that is, but nevertheless, at the time, there was actually less pollution, and the picture proved to be real. I was so stunned that I bought a ticket on Thai International, it was called then. It cost almost nothing, and came over to Nepal. So this would be during the Vietnam War. I had already spent a good bit of time with the 5 battalions of Gurkhas who remained in British service. So I was keenly aware of various facets of Nepali culture. Having made that first visit, which involved doing the Anuradhapura circuit, I then kept coming back, and when things hotted up, if we can call it that, during the Maoist insurgency, the embassy asked me to come back. By this time, I had long since left the military. I was an academic, and they asked Dr. Scott Palmer, who has passed away, but was probably one of the several leading specialists on Shining Path in Peru, and then me as a Maoist specialist to come over to Nepal, and that led to intense involvement, which has never slacked, because once you can get to Nepal on someone else's money, of course, it's a dream come true, because then you can immediately begin to engage with Nepal again. And so I come no less than once a year and have been doing that since, my Lord, it's now the last 24 years. So here we are again.
I mean, that's great. I'm it's very nice to hear that, you've continued with your engagement with Nepal, even, after the end of the Maoist war, when your expertise was greatly needed here, I would say. But since the end of, so I guess let's start talking about the war now. Since today is February 13th, and from your experience and all your research, all your studies, your involvement with the security forces, the state, but also your interactions, your interviews with all the Maoists, what would you say really was the primary reasons behind why the war started?
It's an absolutely critical question, because the answer lies in political factors. And so much energy goes into looking at economic and social factors, and those were not the cause. That is, if you think of politics, Eastman put the process whereby society decides and implements who gets what. Well, Nepal, of course, was a democracy. It was, one can use whatever adjectives one wants, inefficient, corrupt, whatever, but nevertheless, it was not particularly predatory, it was not particularly violent, and it was making tremendous strides. Many of the things which quickly fell into place in the post-war years could be so quickly implemented because they were already on the drawing boards when the insurgency began. So an insurgency is a violent political movement. If you think of a group of elite actors, however defined in Nepal, people with education, overwhelmingly in the beginning, those who had been trained elsewhere, for example. If you think of them looking at Nepal and saying, things are wrong, we need to make them different, the course of action adopted was violence, because the ideological explanation was Maoism, was communism, that said the existing system must be overthrown violently. How, though, did they get so many people to follow them? And you see me discuss that in the article I shared with you about the women who joined. The answer to the simple question, why did so many women join, is really another, why didn't they all join? And the reason is very simple. It's not that their positions were so terrible. They may have been, in a sense. But the bottom line is that a political organization asked them to be a part of something larger than themselves, build a new Nepal at a much greater speed than was being done.
Mhm.
That is how you ended up with the violence you had. And before I turn it back over to you, simply say, notice that the turning point in the violence came when the Maoists, following Maoist doctrine, switched from guerrilla warfare to main force warfare, meaning they formed a People's Liberation Army. The terrorism, the guerrilla warfare in local space continued, but then you had battalions and brigades matched against government battalions and brigades, all with the goal of sweeping away the existing order in order to set up a new order.
So those, as you've written also about how for the Maoists, violence was a way to achieve, to capture, political power or capture the state and reform it in their ideological image, I guess I would say. Um, do you think that those those root causes, those root political causes that led to the Maoists launching their movement in order to change the way things were, do you think those have been addressed now that we are almost 30 years since the launching of the war and over 20 years since the end of the war?
It's a spectacularly astute question because it calls for two answers. The first one is that when you have an existing matrix, if you will, of economic, social, and political systems of social stratification,
Hmm.
things result in violence because of the intervention of two variables. The first one, of course, is ideology. Someone like me, looking at Nepal in 1996, could make a critique which was very much like that made by the Maoists, but they framed their way forward as requiring violence. So it is the political aspects of the analysis which are required to begin the violence. The second intervening variable is always the same, violence by the state. And we're well aware of the role played by Romeo, Kilo Sierra 2. And those, of course, were carried out in areas, Rolpan, Rookham, which were already marginalized and estranged. And you had already a strong commitment to Maoists among certain pockets there. So you end up with the violence occurring. But the violence was contingent. It didn't have to occur. Now, go to the second part of your question. Have we, you said, addressed the causes? The causes were not what caused the insurgency, if you understand what I'm saying. It is the political assessment of the causes
Hmm.
and organizational effort to recruit, the state responding very clumsily, very brutally in some cases, that sets the ball rolling. Rape, for example, committed by the security forces, was listed in my interviews as a major reason why women joined, whether they had experienced it directly or vicariously through those they knew or others. Likewise, once people start joining, you get a dynamic of we versus they. You get relatives join and all. So now go to the present. I mentioned that so many things that were already on the drawing board have now been carried out. You have a completely different Nepal than you did in 1996. The first two things, well, let's say the first three things that happened that were very different from 96. One, you can now get to almost any VDC by road. I do it constantly. I come, I hire a vehicle, and I go to the most obscure places that took me days, if not weeks, to get to during the war. And you can get there quickly. The second thing is that electrification has pushed through to almost every VDC. And the third thing is that the entire country is blanketed with a cellular network. Now, all of these things, with the exception perhaps of cellular, it was planned to be landline, were already happening. So if you go around Nepal today, just stay, for example, at any guest house or hotel in almost any place, and you are talking about a completely different way of life than you had before. Now, look at the other things that have entered. The massive employment overseas, such that remittances are now the number one source of foreign exchange. That existed to a point, but the major source of remittances when things were back in the early 90s remained the Gurkhas of all things. The Gurkhas have run down, but people have gone to work otherwise. And I'll simply include one extraneous comment in answering this. Notice how much energy is devoted in Nepali media to bemoaning, that's the only word for it, the fact that so many Nepalis have to go overseas to work. I'm not commenting on the type of work, but I'm from Hawaii, which is islands, and you're talking to me in Washington, D.C. Why am I here? There are no jobs like this in Hawaii. There are no salaries like this in Hawaii. I left years ago to earn a living. Everybody in my family is on the mainland, as we call it. We're displaced. And you could say, oh, but you're a part of the United States. The East Coast is from where I'm from, that it might as well be the moon. It is that different. So now you put all of these together, the Nepal, which could be mobilized by violent actors, political actors, who said violence is the way forward, that Nepal no longer exists. When you have violence, if you do have future violence, it will probably come from communal issues such as the Tormai against the hill areas that remain as a possibility. Back to you.
So we just you mentioned the army and its responses and its basically its failures or the things that it got wrong that led to an escalation of violence that led to that actually acted as almost like a recruitment drive for the Maoists. Why do you think that this the Nepali army, which had this reputation as like a fighting force, contributed to peacekeeping operations worldwide, but they struggled against an almost ragtag bunch of revolutionaries who had almost no military experience, but somehow they managed to. It was almost a stalemate. Uh, why and The way that the army responded, they kind of went a little overboard. Um, Violence and the number of deaths increased exponentially after the army got involved. Why do you think that was? Like, what were the shortcomings in the Nepali army? And do you think that they've done an assessment? They've maybe reflected on what they lacked and maybe tried to compensate for it in the years since?
Wow. Um, Addressing the Army requires that one address the security forces. And what has happened in Nepal is mirrored in every time something like this happens. That is, violent actors pursue a course of action. The state turns to those who are supposed to be on top of these things. So, of course, the army wasn't committed till after the Gorahi attack in late 2001. So you've got 5 years when it is the police who lead, and in the midst of this, you have the armed police formed. But the police, while they had some special units to deal with riots and things like that, really not prepared for what we're called upon to do. And this is when you saw the abuses, the heart of the abuses. Now you see the same thing happen, for example, in Peru and other places where this has erupted. Once the ball gets rolling in an insurgency, things begin to change very rapidly. I mentioned rape, for example. That was done almost exclusively by the police. There were things that happened that the army did, but nevertheless, it was the actions of the police, and one shouldn't just pile on. They were trying to do their duty, and they were given tasks for which they had no training, for which they were completely unarmed. The whole force had at the most the 303, and they were simply overwhelmed by it all because armed actors could choose time and place. Imagine a small police post that suddenly finds itself surrounded by several hundred assailants. Now, this is the dynamic which always occurs. You have terrorism in local space. That terrorism, defined very simply, is attacking the innocent, which is someone the Maoists would define as a large landowner. They attack that person and they move the rallying points in local space. People, no matter how bad the police are, have to turn to someone. But the Maoists know that the police stations. In my own work, I give the statistics of how very rapidly the state simply imploded throughout Nepal. Thus, by the time the army was committed, 70 to 80% of the populace had already fallen under Maoist sway. Now, you get to your point you raised. The army had only done United Nations peacekeeping. Peacekeeping can train you to do many things, but it doesn't train you for the sort of tasks the army do against the Maoists. The army had to learn. Now, we, of course, study adaptation And I've written a deal about this, for example, what happened in Colombia, which offered some lessons for Nepal. In a very short time, late 2001 to by the time early 2005 came, and the political shift occurred. The army had become very different force than it was going on. And that's why the stalemate occurred, because Army had forced stalemate, and you see now as recognizing that the change in the political.
Got you. I'm sorry, we seem to be having some technical issues. I think we lost Dr. Marks. Let's wait for a bit so that he can reconnect.
In the meanwhile, if anybody has questions for Pranay, while we wait on Dr. Marks to rejoin this conversation, please feel free to ask them.
May I chip in
Hello?
a little bit? Oh, okay, he's back.
Are we there?
Hello, Dr. Marks.
Uh,
Sorry, we
you're,
have lost you for a bit.
are you there?
Yeah, we're
Can
all
you
there.
hear me?
Hmm?
Okay, we're back. But so when we got off, we were at you had a you had a complete change in context, if you will. And once the king succeeded in alienating the political parties, the Maoists, because they had studied very carefully what had occurred before, made the decision at their September 2005 Chunwang meeting to engage in a united front approach. This coincided with a shift in consciousness within.
Oh no. Oh no, we lost him again. Sorry, please be patient. Dr. Marks, I think we lost you again. Please be patient. Let's wait for Dr. Marks to come back. If any of
All
you have
right.
questions, please let me know. Here we go. Dr. Marks, are you back?
I think I'm back. But
I think the connection is a bit choppy.
well, whenever we have super bad weather, these things happen. I'm going to go to a different part of the building here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can see you.
Okay, I'm out where the snow is. Hopefully it will work better.
There we go.
Okay, I can see me.
Yeah, we can see you. We can actually hear you. I think it might be better here.
Terrific. Okay, I'm back, and I can see all of you, although most people are little whiteheads. But we were saying that at the very time the Maoists opted to make their alliance with the political parties, the military understood very well what was going on, and the shift has been portrayed as the Maoists agreeing to enter the political system. That is not what happened at all. Indeed, if you read their Central Committee documents, their Politburo documents, all in Nepali but have gradually surfaced, you see what was known at the time. They agreed to place their main forces in the camps, but to shift their violent capacity into the YCL. And a great many of the PLA chain of command were transferred to the YCL and became their chain of command. So you have a classic paramilitary capacity. And this is why things were so astonishingly violent in Nepal all the way up till CA2. And if you'll recall, before CA2, Bhattarai had assumed the prime ministership, and you had a very intense discussion within the Maoists, which went something like, we are in power. What do we do with it? And ultimately, as you know, the party had several splits, the biggest ones 2012, Baija, and 2014, Biplav. Those splits were over the nature of violence in order to remake the system. On the one hand, you have Bhattarai arguing, you fools, we are the system now. Mm-hmm. You have the radical wing of the Maoists saying, some revolution. We need to take this one all the way into the end zone, to use our football term. Thus, you had the split. Thus, you had a substantial level of violence, even during CA1. That was not successful. You have Biplav saying, you're just not very good at this, even though he had broken away with Baija. And then you have, again, substantial violence during the 2017 elections. Eventually, Biplav comes back into the system, but the agreement is you can continue to do what you were doing, but no more bombs. Mm-hmm. And so this is why you have the situation you have today. Now, notice this all comes from your point about the Army. The Army knew all this. The Army had learned to understand all this. And when the Maoists, after the CA1, made the move to seize control of the army, thus you had Katawal thwart that. Otherwise, you would have a different Nepal.
Mm. Do you really think that the clash between Prachanda and Kotwal at that time it really came from a desire to seize control of the army and thereby the state, or was it more of a political move?
Well, he very definitely, it was an effort to seize control of the army. There would then be amalgamation of the PLA and then NA, having transformed from RNA, and having amalgamated them, you would ultimately have the power within the system to be able to reshape the system. There was never any intent to give up revolutionary objectives. This was stated at the in the Chunwang documents very, very clearly.
Mhm.
It said all we're doing is parking the main forces. The YCL will be our action arm. We will be able to go into government spaces, and using mass action, we ultimately will seize power. We will be the ones calling the shots. And this again took a form they did not anticipate. I mean, imagine the debate that went on when Bhattarai becomes the prime minister and is arguing that that the Maoists are the system.
Mhm.
I have a question here. Do you want me to answer it in the chat?
Let's keep those for the end, and we can start.
Let's see.
We can just progress through our discussion, and then final 10-15 minutes, then we can get to the questions.
Okay, well, but it's interesting that the question that is asked leads right to where we were going. So I'll kill two birds with one stone. The heart of what we the heart of what we've been discussing, of course, all politics revolves around politicians and voters, if you will. Leaders are not followers. It is leaders. It is the Maoist leadership which presented a vision of a new society, which presented an analysis of the existing society.
Hmm.
That vision is only shared by the manpower to the extent that they learned a new vocabulary, they learned a new method of analysis, but their understanding was very, very shallow. When you interview people, for example, you take my interviews with the women, they would all, a majority of them were small shop owners by this point. I would say, well, you're capitalists. And they would, of course, get quite exercised by this and say, we are not capitalists. Capitalists are evil, rotten, and nasty, etc. Well, the point is because they had never learned any other attribution except that, they were using the vocabulary in a way which could be leveraged by the leadership, but wasn't precisely accurate. Now, where did women fall into this? It's absolutely fascinating because, of course, any insurgency is trying to leverage marginalized, alienated groups, particularly those who have been subjected to violence by the state. Thus, you had many Dalits join, you had many other groups join. Women, being 50% of the population in a patriarchal society, were a logical target for recruitment. This, though, brings up two levels of argument, which apply just to what we're talking about. On the one hand, are women somehow being liberated by their experience in joining violent efforts to seize state power? I would say no, they're not. On the one hand, women got to do many things that otherwise they would not be able to do. They got to be riflemen, for example. Interviewing a woman who attacked Jumla in 2002 while she was pregnant is a pretty sobering experience because they were determined to be equals. On the other hand, notice the other side of the argument. Women were not empowered in terms of power. No woman had a leadership position that mattered within the Maoists. Bhattarai's wife is often presented as a leading figure. She was never a leading figure because she was in India. She was marginalized, but she was, after all, Bhattarai's wife. The point is that just as Nepali society was all male, so were the Maoists in terms of those who called the shots. So if you look at your question about where are we today, have things improved? The one argument says we would have been here anyway. I tend to agree with that, looking at it. The other argument says that at least for a slice of individuals, things changed. And I think this can be illustrated by the fact that a majority of the marriages of the individuals I interviewed were intercommunal, if you will. And that's pretty impressive. And so they were leading normal lives, but people had married Dalits, people had this and that. But nevertheless, it's still Nepal. How Nepal has changed, I've argued in my own publication, is that as the total matrix of power has changed, you have seen a different Nepal emerge. Nevertheless, one more point before I turn this back to you. Notice that you've got some real wild cards in this. You have a new Nepal, but the more things change, the more they remain the same. Corruption, rank dishonesty are still major problems, as is the incapacity to think strategically. The various strategic thought that has come out of the Maoists or the communists, the UML, when they've been in power is lamentable, meaning it's as though they just don't understand that when elephants play and ants are on the ground, they're going to get stomped on. You simply don't do certain things. And you see very good analyses by Deepak Thapa, C.K. Lal. There's no shortage of excellent analysis.
Mhm. Mhm. No, I tend to agree that, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Uh, because we can still see, despite all the momentous changes that Nepal has gone through, our top leaders are still three, Hindu, upper caste, caste Arya men, who are all either Bounds or Chetris, which was reflected also in the Maoists, and is continues to be reproduced even today. So, how much?
And
Yes,
I
please.
don't know if you saw my article on MCC at the time. I think it was in the Himalayan Times, but it speaks directly to what you're saying. On the one hand, for decades, both sides, the Nepalis and the Americans, had tried to get a grant in order to construct that portion of the grid, if you will. It was free money. And of course, the energy put into thwarting it so that something else could occur was simply amazing. And I mentioned my writing on it because I was very blunt. If you don't want the money, meaning if the government doesn't want the money, I want the money. And I'm not greedy. I don't want all 500 million. Just give me one and I'll be perfectly happy. But it's that type of thought which absolutely baffles me. Turning down the relationship with the National Guard, for example, absolutely foolish. Because who is the National Guard here? I'm talking about the partnership all over the world so that they can maintain their skills. The National Guard goes out and helps people on whatever they decide they need to be helped on, whether it's doing riverine patrol or whether it's this or that, because they're really civilians who happen to be in uniform. And the program exists so that they can do this sort of thing. All right, you turn it down. Where, what fills the gap? So it's funny, and it allows people like me to write about it, but it doesn't produce solutions. And someone should be thinking that way. I'll give you one more and then I'll stop babbling, whatever. Notice that Venezuela is in the news again here. I mean, this is a country that 7 to 8 million of its people have fled because it is such a disaster under what it calls a Bolivarian system, which is very much like that peddled by the Maoists there. So if you recall when Dahal and Ali had their union, as soon as Ali was out of the country, Dahal held that seminar where he invited the Venezuelans and talked about how everyone was picking on them. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about when I just sheer geostrategic ignorance of what's going on. Back to you.
Okay, I think now we have a couple of questions from the audience, so we can get to them. Let me read out this question that I received from Hiraji. Says it is very difficult for the state to neutralize the rebels legitimately and at the same time build its own local space. How can the state perform at the local level to be trusted by the people?
Wow. And if we knew that, we could get the United Nations to function. No, it's interesting that we've mentioned words like integrity, the need to not be corrupt, the need to empower the people. It was really amazing how the Peruvians answered this question. On the one hand, there has to be a violent response to the violence of Shining Path or Sendero Luminoso. The people, in fact, have been so brutalized by this point, about 1990, that they were demanding weapons. So under Fujimori, they did get some weapons, but more importantly than that, the non-violent component of the Peruvian approach was directed at addressing building legitimacy in local space. And the way they did this was to go to all the villages and say, we're your government, you're the voters. What do you need? Now, we can't do everything. We're a poor country. We have a menu. It was under an organization called FUNCODES, which is an acronym in Spanish for local development. So they had a menu, and each village could choose one thing, such as they want a road or they want electrification. The state would provide an engineer to guide it or a piece of heavy machinery, but all work had to be done by the villagers. They had to organize and they were paid for their work, but money had to be accepted by an elected committee. It had to be distributed, and what was being done had to be posted publicly. The result was that when Shining Path tried to destroy what was created, the people would defend it in the same way my neighborhood here has again, for the second time, had to stand up neighborhood watch because we're having trouble with criminals coming into to our neighborhood at night and doing things. It is no different in a situation like this. And you end up then with the people ultimately using their votes to continue the process. The areas of the insurgency in Peru remain among the largest voter turnout areas of Peru. So the summary to your question is you do the specific things which empower the people within the law, and they realize that what they are a part of works for them. And then they continue it through their vote. Mm-hmm. The next question that's here, I'll just roll if that's okay. Sure. It's what was the role of India and China in this? It's fascinating. I always got asked the China part here in the United States, and I would say they had no role. But India, of course, had quite a large role because India was playing all sides in this. And many of the articles about India tend to lead one point or another. That is, the Maoist leadership throughout this entire business was in India. Mm-hmm. The Indians knew where they were. Occasionally, though, they would arrest some of them, but for their own geostrategic reasons. Ultimately, they decided that subverting the monarch and backing SPA plus the Maoists was the way to get the whole business under control and thus to serve India's needs. They were upset with two things. Number one, Gyanendra may have been many things, but he was a nationalist, and the Indians did not want that. The second thing is that the key external powers who were assisting the Nepalis were, of course, the United States and Britain. And while our aid was very minimal, the US, for example, had two officers in its embassy who were devoted to this problem. Nevertheless, India could see that this one was not going the way it wanted. For example, India, even at the tactical level, wanted Nepal to use the Insas rifle, which was a piece of junk, and the Nepalis wanted the M16, which worked better. So things like that caused the Indians to play their cards the way they did. ultimately, of course, you had a resolution, and India has continued to play the cards. I'll just close with that for a moment, talking about the present. I think C.K. Lal and others have talked about this. I don't mean to drag him into this, but he's had some very good articles recently in the Kathmandu Post, and there have been others which have pointed out pretending that China is just a disinterested helpmate is so astoundingly naive that only a certain segment of the Nepali political spectrum could come up with that. One can say the things we've just said about India, and yet at the same time, one has to recognize that for all its problems, which I've written about extensively, India is a democracy. India is tied to Nepal in every way you can think of. So to create, in effect, either an alternative or a threat by getting linked to China through Tibet is simply not very smart politics. It's, there is a question that says, does the Hall really believe in Marxism, or is he just playing a game? Well, these people really do believe in communism and Marxism. We all understand Marx set the terms of engagement, Lenin, how to seize power, Mao, you have to have a continuing revolution. They believe this, but by the same token, they face what all groups do when they get power. When you're in charge, how do you make things different? Now, in cases like Mao and Stalin, they've given us some of the greatest crimes that humanity has ever witnessed. And the throwback, of course, is that capitalism has done this and that, but you end up arguing whether you're talking about manslaughter or murder. And manslaughter certainly has a different level of punishment, shall we say. So they really do believe in these things, but they too, at this point in time, have been sucked into the classic Nepali system. The Maoists are so corrupt, it makes the news very rapidly. One can think of gold as an example, and I don't need to go into it, but when you're making hundreds of phone calls trying to spring your illicit gold shipment, then you know, Houston, we have a problem.
So we have, I think, one more question there. It's a follow-up. It says,
Hey, the final, do you want me to get the last question there? I'm quickly reading it. I don't think I'm separating ESP, economic, social, political. In fact, we teach them like a mantra here, combining them with geography and history. What I am saying is that politicians have to get followers. Of course, if you're dealing with people who live in poverty, then you're going to pitch a solution to that poverty. But the people you're pitching it to rarely, if ever, embrace the small print. Rather, they embrace the fact that you say you have a solution. And that's what I meant by saying very few of the individuals I have interviewed, even at the officer level, understand the first thing about Maoism as an ideology. But if you get at the upper top, they really do believe it and will debate it. Someone like Baija, for example, is an unrepentant Stalinist in his communism. And you can go on and on. Bhattarai, of course, found himself between a rock and a hard place, I would say. At this point in time, he is a classic socialist, but he can never say that because then someone's going to sue you at a minimum. At least in US law, you would be sued because you set the ball rolling and created all these deaths. And if I could just add that one point to end, it's very important when you're talking about the Maoist phenomenon to realize it's not just the 18,000 dead, which is the most definitive figure now. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who were brutalized in local space. People with their arms cut off with kukris are not dead, but neither are they alive anymore. And you can interview them, people whose legs have been broken, et cetera, et cetera. The PLA was one aspect of this and played, let's say, did what it did as cleanly as any main force military can. That's not where all the violence came from. The violence came from the Maoists in local space. And that has never been adequately covered in scholarship or in journalism. And it is trying to cover it that I devote so much of my time, thus my publications on that. Back to you, Pranaya.
Okay. I think we are nearing the end of our conversation. So, fine. I mean, whenever this anniversary, February 13th comes around, we in Nepal always tend to ask ourselves, was it worth it? You know, all those years of violence, all the thousands killed, all the thousands injured, the long lasting, the trauma of the war that so many still bear, and who have not, transitional justice still hasn't been addressed. So many people still don't know what happened to their loved ones, the disappeared, the missing. So we always tend to ask ourselves, was it worth it? And of course, there isn't really an answer. We can't say, yes, 18,000 people killed, that to the Nepal that we have today was worth the sacrifice of those people. What would you say to this question? How would you?
I would say your question goes exactly to where I have devoted so much of my recent work. Transitional justice is going to work in Nepal only if it doesn't work. By that I mean very simply, if you look at, for example, the extraordinary chambers case concerning the Khmer Rouge, or the ones concerning the communists in Ethiopia, they all make the same point. Certain things can be excused and certain things cannot. Those things that cannot were not only what the Maoists did in local space, it was their doctrine, as we call it. What the security forces did was a violation of their own rules of Nepali law. That's why they need to be recognized for that or outed for that. In contrast, what the Maoists did in things like chopping off someone's arm with a kukri is what they were told they were supposed to do to attack the system. or pouring molten metal into a guy's eyes in a case that's made the newspaper. So you have very different actions which have to be dealt with. And the only way those will be dealt with, because they're actionable, is if a way is found to pretend they didn't occur, to say that the constant exhortations to commit atrocities in local space were just the Maoists getting carried away in their political project. That doesn't hold analytical water, but that is what they have to argue.
Mhm. So finally, I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. I guess uh, because the more distance we get from the war, um, we have generations now that are growing up with no direct experience of the violence, the times that I lived through, and of course, I wasn't directly affected by the violence because I lived in Kathmandu. I had a relatively safe time here, but still, uh, we did know what was happening and how it unfolded. Uh, the more distance we get, the more we tend to forget, I think, Nepalis, that the conditions that led to what happened, we find ourselves asking, could it recur? Could it ever happen again? Could we ever have another similar insurgency or similar movement that tries to do similar things? Uh, what do you think is where do the threats to Nepal come from today? Is it internal? Is it external?
I think you could have a Gujarat, but you will not have another ideological insurgency. I use Gujarat because notice it was political actors, at least one of whom many of us can name, who exploited circumstances of communalism to cause the entire area of India to explode and crimes to be committed, which are so heinous, they've been well documented. That's always a danger in Nepal, where you are so diverse and you have so many people demanding a slice of the pie, so to speak. There will always be a politician who will step in and say, I can give you that slice. Violence is never off the table in such circumstances. But ideologically, what we've been talking about, the Maoists, that day has passed, I would argue, because Nepal is so different. Thus, you could have, in what I'm calling Gujarat, you could have a Hindu chauvinist uprising, you could have this, you could have that. And that is something that Nepal needs to be on top of and to ensure does not happen.
Yep. No, I definitely I agree with that, especially with what's happening south of the border. So much of that leaks into Nepal, and I hope we never get to that point where we are also fighting amongst ourselves, and the kind of communal violence that has been rising in India ever since Mr. who cannot be named, who he must not be named, has taken power. I hope that doesn't happen, but like you said, there is always the possibility, and that's something that we Nepali should always guard ourselves against. Um, so I think that's all of the questions and the discussion points we have. If is there anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Well, I would just like to add, we've been talking, of course, about the sharp edge here. We should end on the other end. I've said in print many times that the reason things generally work out in Nepal is because of Nepalis. The reason people like me keep returning is because of Nepalis. You simply cannot find a society which is like Nepal. And in that, there is great strength. And in sessions like this and publications like yours, there is hope. So I hope we continue.
That's very nice of you, Dr. Marks. Thank you so much. This was a very enlightening, illuminating conversation, and I'm so thankful that you took the time to speak to us, speak to me, really, and our small audience of very dedicated readers and listeners. Uh, I'm very, very grateful for not just for this conversation, for you've been a patron of the newsletter that I send out. You read it all the time. So I really, really thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It was very, very entertaining. And the next time that you are in Nepal, I hope we can catch up and continue this
Thank you.
conversation in person.
All right. Have a good day. Bye.
Dr. Marks, thank you so much.